One of the most chaotic periods in English history saw the Wars of the Roses grip the nation, and thousands of people were killed fighting for the House of Lancaster and the House of York. In this turbulent time during the medieval period, the crown passed between the feuding dynasties a number of times. There were Lancastrian kings and Yorkist kings. Some of them died very mysterious deaths inside of one of the most brutal prisons in history. But in the centuries after their deaths, the tombs and coffins of these kings have been opened, and what was found was remarkable, including the remains of a king who was discovered over 500 years after his death under a car park inside of an English city. Today we look inside the coffins of the Wars of the Roses kings of England, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry VI's reign over England was rather disastrous. He managed to lose most of the territory that his father Henry V had gained during the 100 Years' War, and the political unrest in England would break out into the Wars of the Roses, a civil war where many backed the House of York over the King's House of Lancaster. From 1453, the king suffered with his mental health, and he did experience a breakdown, leaving him unable to rule with arguing nobles than governing England, whilst the king recovered. The Wars of the Roses broke out in 1455, and in 1461, Henry VI was deposed by the Duke of York's eldest son, who then took the throne as King Edward IV. In the grand scheme of the Wars of the Roses, Henry VI really was a loser, and Edward IV was the great victor. Henry VI was, after being deposed, later captured in 1465, and he was imprisoned inside of the Tower of London for the first time. He was briefly held in good conditions, but Henry would later be restored to the throne by Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who was also known as the Kingmaker. This restoration, known as the Redemption, was the first in English history, a king being deposed and then coming back to the throne. It lasted less than 6 months, however, as the Earl of Warwick then declared war on Burgundy, and Edward IV was helped with trying to win the throne back. Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, and following the decisive Yorkist victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, Henry VI's son was killed, and Henry would then be deposed again, and he was then locked inside of the Tower of London. He was held as a prisoner of Edward IV, and the king would order his rival to be dealt with once and for all. When the royal party arrived in London, following the battle and various stays outside the capital, it was reported to Edward that Henry VI was dead. Official chronicles and documents claim that the deposed monarch died on the evening of the 21st of May 1471. It is most probable that his enemies, as in the House of York, had kept him alive for a number of weeks, and they were concerned that Henry's son Edward, who was a much more skilled military commander, would take up the mantle and fight against them. But it soon became clear to King Edward IV that Henry VI would become a burden to him, and possibly a threat, as whilst he was alive there was always the possibility of Henry being broken out of the tower in a plot to bring him back as the king. Now, at the time it was claimed, according to a chronicle favourable to Edward IV, that Henry VI had died of depression and melancholy following the death of his son and the loss of his throne. But there had been much more widely believed possibility that Henry had been murdered upon the orders of Edward IV, and that he had encountered a brutal and bloody end. The Tudor chronicler Sir Thomas More documented in his History of Richard III that Richard, who was the Duke of Gloucester at the time, murdered Henry, who was inside of the tower. It was claimed that he was praying inside of the Wakefield Tower in a small chapel when he was attacked from behind and was slaughtered in a brutal and barbaric attack. There is doubt about this due to the fact that Wakefield Tower was being used for storage at the time, and it was not necessarily a royal apartment or a prison. He was locked up within the tower, but The rumours about the fate of Henry VI were later confirmed centuries after his death. Following his death, the body of Henry VI was buried inside of the Chertsey Abbey. The body had been paraded in an open coffin and carried through London to Old St Paul's Cathedral, where it was displayed for several days so that people could see that the former king was really dead. Henry's coffin was taken to the Blackfriars Monastery, where the funeral then took place. The coffin was then loaded onto a barge and was taken 15 miles up the River Thames for burial inside of the Lady Chapel at Chertsey Abbey. But then the burial place became a site of pilgrimage, and many would flock there, and it was claimed that miracles took place around the tomb of the former king. Richard III, because of this, had the body exhumed on the 12th of August 1495, and it was claimed that the body was perfectly preserved, and it was then taken to St George's Chapel in Windsor, where it was interred just southwest of the altar on the opposite side of Henry's enemy, Edward IV. The tomb was initially a low table tomb with a recumbent figure of the king in his armour, but then before 1492 there was an appeal to the Pope to possibly canonise Henry VI as a saint. Later, King Henry VII, the first Tudor king, would create the Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, and he wanted to bury Henry VI there. There was authorisation made to exhume the body of the king in 1504, ready to be interred in Westminster Abbey, but this never took place, and he was left inside of his initial tomb, inside of St George's Chapel. Nothing occurred regarding this canonisation too, and he was not made a saint. For some reason, the vault of King Henry VI was moved in 1786 and relocated, but it was not opened, and the coffin was not opened. A small slab was left, marking the site. However, in January of 1910, the brick vault which held the former king's body was opened, and inside of this there was a small lead chest which was found in a significant amount of litter and waste, including the iron straps from the rotten wooden coffin that had measured roughly 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. The chest and coffin were then investigated on the 5th of November 1910, and it was stated that it was found to contain a decayed wooden box, which was then collected and gathered, and the bones of King Henry VI were there. The bones were in no order at all, and the skull was found to have been broken in places, and the right arm was also missing. However, upon further analysis of the skull, remarkable things were discovered and found alluding to the fate and death of Henry VI. On the king's skull, there was some brown hair which was still attached to it almost 500 years after his death, but part of the hair had much darker than others, and it contained, matted within the hair, blood, meaning that following his death, Henry VI's head and hair had not been washed during the embalming process. The fact that blood was still in the king's hair showed the nature of his death, and that it was brutal and horrific, and that he was most probably murdered whilst he was imprisoned inside the Tower of London. It's determined from examining his remains that he was either struck with a heavy object or weapon, or that he had been stabbed, being struck in the head with something such as a sword. After the analysis of the king's remains, the chest containing his bones was repaired, and the bones were all individually wrapped in silk and were then placed inside of the chest, along with parts of the ironwork, and a new marble slab was made, marking the site of his burial. Today, King Henry VI is considered a king who was not the greatest. Neither was he prepared for kingship, as he was just 8 months old when he became the ruler of England. He is remembered as also a king of France, and the biggest loser of the Wars of the Roses. He was someone who achieved little, and he helped to plunge his nation into civil war, and his mental fragility did little to establish England as a strong nation being ruled over by a dominant ruler. Inside the Tower of London, Henry VI was slain and murdered, probably upon the orders of his enemies, but his coffin was opened 500 years after his brutal death, telling the true story of his fate. Edward IV was born on the 28th of April 1442 inside of France, and his father was Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, who led the House of York's claim to the English throne. His father helped to begin with the Wars of Roses, fighting against the Lancastrians, and this began when Edward was a teenager, and his father was killed during the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, and Edward then inherited his father's claim to the English throne. With the help of the Earl of Warwick, a man known as the Kingmaker, Edward fought against King Henry VI's armies, and he would defeat the Lancastrians in a number of battles, including the devastating Battle of Towton in 1461. Following this, Henry VI was overthrown, and Edward IV was crowned the King of England by the right of conquest. However, the Earl of Warwick thought that he could now be the true power behind the king, and he would eventually turn on Edward due to the fury he had about the king's marriage with Elizabeth Woodville. Warwick thought that he was being pushed aside, and that he then, along with Edward IV's brother George Plantagenet, picked up the fight against Edward. He was briefly deposed in 1471, but then returned to the throne, and following this he had Henry VI put to death inside the Tower of London. Edward's second reign was more peaceful and secure, and he raised money from the estates he gained to pay for governmental projects, and he did not need much money from Parliament, and only called them a minimal amount of times. Further treaties helped to develop trade in England, and councils were established to help keep control up north and also keep the area near to Wales safe. In his final years, Edward IV's health began to fail and go downhill. His doctors ordered a huge amount of medicine to treat him, but Edward did not have the healthiest lifestyle. He became very ill in the Easter of 1483, but succumbed to his death on the 9th of April, 1483. The cause of his death was not known. At the time, some believed he had been poisoned by enemies, but some claim that he died of a disease such as malaria or even pneumonia. He chose to be buried inside of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, which he had expanded and developed, and specifically he was interred inside of a burial vault near to the high altar. A huge monument was planned to mark the site of Edward IV's burial, and this would have shown the king in an effigy form, but the work for this was never carried out, and today Edward's burial vault and site is marked by a simple black marble slab. The burial vault was important when the chapel was renovated, and one of the pillars of it supports an arch above, but the vault itself is roughly 3 meters long, and it is 1.4 meters wide and roughly this height. This means it isn't tall or big and is roughly 2 meters beneath the floor of the chapel. King Edward IV's coffin was interred inside of this vault on the 19th of April 1483, and later the coffin of his wife was placed inside of here too. The tomb of the king which stood was damaged heavily during the Commonwealth following the English Civil War, and it would then later be reconstructed slightly in the late 18th century. However, for some time, the burial vault of Edward IV seemingly was lost, especially the entrance to it, and many people tried their best to search for it. In 1788, people inside of St. George's Chapel searched for the entrance to the vault from the choir, making holes in the floor, but then in the following March there was repair work being carried out on the floor, and with this the burial vault of Edward IV was discovered and found. What was discovered was shocking. There was desecration and destruction which occurred inside of the burial vault. It was found that the remains of Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen, had been terribly treated. Someone had entered the vault, broken up her coffin and taken her remains out, and the bones had been scattered all over the vault, and they were actually mixed into the rubble and brick, which were found also in the vault. Her skull was even found, and the bones of the queen were scattered everywhere. It's not known who did this. It could have been done following the Civil War with the desecration of the tomb monument, or maybe someone took it upon themselves to treat the remains of Elizabeth Woodville terribly. Her reputation throughout the centuries did have a significant amount of damage. Under all of the rubble, the coffin of King Edward IV was found, and this was said to have been rather undamaged and in a good condition. This was then opened, and despite the king's body being embalmed, it was in a rather bad way. The skeletal remains of Edward IV were discovered, and there was no soft tissue preserved on his skeleton, but it was found inside of the coffin that some of the king's long brown hair had fallen off of his skull, and the king's hair was then found, but inside of the coffin it was discovered that a significant amount of liquid was inside of the bottom of the coffin, and the feet and lower legs of Edward IV were submerged in this, and this would not have helped the preservation over the centuries. The coffin of King Edward IV was then secured shut after the inspection of his remains, and the burial vault was then sealed. It's not known what happened to the remains of Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen. They may have been gathered and placed inside of a new coffin or a vessel, but they may have also just been left as they were. Interestingly, opposite Edward IV, inside of St George's Chapel, is the nemesis of the king, Henry VI, the man who many believed actually was put to death by Edward and murdered inside the Tower of London. Other monarchs buried nearby, inside of St George's Chapel, include Henry VIII, the notorious six-wifed Tudor monarch, and King Charles I, the executed King of England. King Edward IV was the Yorkist king, a man who took the throne by rights of conquest after inheriting his father's claim to the throne. He was someone who later brought stability to the crown after a period which was plagued with battles and bloodshed. He died at the age of 40 and was buried in a chapel that he preferred rather than Westminster Abbey, and he was interred close to his nemesis, Henry VI. He is considered one of the victors of the Wars of the Roses, but the House of York would be deposed 2 years after his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field, when his coffin was opened. Many people believe that interred inside of this entombing sculpture are the remains of the young princes in the Tower, the 2 children of King Edward IV, Edward V and his brother, Richard the Duke of York. The young princes in the Tower mystery has for centuries puzzled historians and captivated millions, as their disappearance inside the Tower of London is often linked to the rise of their uncle King Richard III, the very man who was appointed to protect them. But instead, Richard is often said to have had the boys murdered and disgraced publicly so that he could take the throne for himself. But inside the tomb within Westminster Abbey are the bones of 2 children. But there was also a lot of shocking finds found within this vessel when it was opened in the early 20th century, but there are still many questions about these bones, and there are hopes that these remains will one day be subjected to DNA analysis to try to piece the princes in the Tower mystery together once and for all. But what is inside of this tomb? The princes in the Tower are mentioned, and Edward V, the King of England and rightful successor of King Edward IV, and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York. The pair were inside of the Tower of London, and they were awaiting the coronation of the King, Edward V, but they at the time went missing and disappeared. Richard III, their uncle, usurped the throne, and he spoke out against the 2 boys, his nephews, and claimed that their mother and father's marriage was illegitimate and that he was the rightful King of England. But for years this mystery had no leads. However, in 1674 a number of bones were discovered by builders who were doing work inside the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London. Under a staircase they found the remains of 2 young children, and it was considered a strange place for the burials of 2 children to be made. These then were linked to the princes in the Tower, and at the time the King of England, Charles II, ordered that these skeletons should be treated as if they were the boys. He made huge arrangements for the interring of these remains inside of Westminster Abbey. The remains, or the collections of bones, were not placed inside of coffins, but they were collected and were held before a white marble sarcophagus was crafted and made for them. This was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and this urn was made by Joshua Marshall, the King's master mason. All of this shows how King Charles II was certain that these were the remains of Edward V and Richard the Duke of York. The warrant for the creation of the urn, dated on the 18th of February 1675, said, These are to signify His Majesty's pleasure that you provide a white marble coffin for the supposed bodies of ye two princes lately found in the Tower of London, and that you cause the same to be interred in Henry VII's Lady Chapel, in such convenient place as the death of Westminster shall appoint. The urn was very well decorated, and to begin with, it had 2 crowns and plumes on top, but these then disappeared. As was requested by the king, the burial urn was placed in the north aisle of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, close to the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch and queen. A Latin inscription was carved into the urn, and this translated into English says, "Here lie the relics of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, these brothers being confined in the Tower of London, and there, stifled with pillows, were privately and meanly buried, by the order of their perfidious uncle Richard the Usurper, whose bones long inquired after and wished for, after 191 years in the rubbish of the stairs, those lately leading to the chapel of the White Tower, were on the 17th day of July 1674, by undoubted proofs discovered, being buried deep in place. Charles II, a most compassionate prince, pitying their severe fate, ordered these unhappy princes to be laid amongst the monuments of their predecessors, 1678, in the 30th year of his reign." By all accounts, King Charles II believed that these bones were the remains of the boys, and one, of course, was the King of England. There has even been controversy over these remains over the centuries, and Queen Elizabeth II, the recently deceased queen, actually refused DNA testing on the bones many times, and it's not necessarily known why. Possibly she believed that the bones were of the princes, then it may have weakened her claim to the throne, or maybe she just believed that the mystery of these boys was best left as it was, and that it would have been wrong to extract DNA from the remains of the boys, and that this would be too invasive. There is hope that King Charles III would be more willing to subject the remains to some more vigorous scientific analysis, to hopefully bring some form of closure onto this. And it is known that he is certainly more likely to grant this request than his mother was. But the burial urn was actually opened in 1933. However, what was found was shocking, and it's also left a lot to be desired, especially due to the fact that the men who did this did not really do a proper thorough job. Despite the investigation being a 20th century one, it was rather poorly carried out. In 1933, the Dean of Westminster agreed to allow the urn to be opened and then inspected. This he hoped would bring an end to speculation. The examination was conducted by Lawrence E. Tanner, the keeper of the monuments, and also the record keeper of the library, William Wright, the president of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and they were helped by a dental surgeon, Dr. George Northcroft, who was a specialist in children's dentistry. It was hoped that this man would be able to help deal with any teeth inside of the urn. In front of an audience of invited people, the urn was opened, and inside of the vessel many things were found. Part of Westminster Abbey was the location for its investigation and not a scientific room. The examination came up with a number of different conclusions, and it was found the remains were of 2 boys aged around 12 and 10. The experts measured the parts and also came up with this, and this of course is around the correct ages for the 2 princes of the disappeared princes inside the Tower of London. Many remains were discovered, including the cranial vault, which was said to have belonged to King Edward V. But one thing to consider is that the investigation did not specifically conclude that these bones and remains belonged to the missing princes. This was put together and as concluded based on the age of the bones, but the men who looked at the remains did not say this themselves. It was said that it will be noted that Professor Wright, for convenience, assumed that these bones were those of Edward and Richard. This was perhaps unfortunate, for it has led some people to suppose that we definitely identified the bones as those princes. No such claim was made, and I was in fact particularly careful in the paper, which we read before the Society of Antiquaries, to make no such identification, and to adopt a cautious and not proven attitude throughout. They reached the conclusion that these were the bones of 2 children, aged 10 and 12, And there was also some staining on the skull, which experts believed was consistent with the bloodstains caused by force of suffocation, indicating that these two boys were inside the Tower of London and were suffocated. This was something which obviously would make sense. However, what is strange is that the investigations missed a number of key things that could have added more proof that these were the bones of the princes. One thing they missed was looking at the gender of the remains. As if they were belonged to a girl, then of course this would cast it into serious doubt. They also did not really date the bones, and they did not come up with a rough estimate as to how old these remains were. If they were too early for the 15th century, this would also cast them into doubt. Photographs were taken of some of the remains, and there was also some questions that the stain on the skull was not a blood stain at all, but, strangely, amongst some of the bones was also a collection of animal bones, meaning these had been thrown inside of the urn too, practically alluding to the fact that these children had been interred with litter. One of the men who carried out the investigation claimed that, as to what happened after their death, no one can say, but I imagine that when the place in the elm chest in which they were found, Edward lay at the bottom on his back with a slight tilt to the left, and that Richard lay above him, face to face, and that when the chest was discovered in the 17th century, the workmen broke into it from above and near its middle. I am led to these conclusions from the fact that there was far more of Edward's skeleton present than that of Richard's, since presumably lying deeper, it was less disturbed. Ribs, no less than 6, have been found, and that of these 3 were on the left side and belonged to Edward, and 3 on the right side belonged to Richard, and that similarly 1 of the left clavicle of Edward and the right clavicle of Richard were present, strongly suggesting that the left shoulder of Edward had been in close contact with the right shoulder of Richard's. Need I go on? He described the state of the remains and said that, on the examination commencing, it soon became apparent that the bones were those of 2 children of about the right age for the princes. Parts of 2 skulls, 2 jawbones, 2 thigh bones were seen to be there, and the thigh bones, when placed side by side, demonstrated that one was longer than the other. This was the first and last time the burial urn containing allegedly the 2 princes in the tower has been opened, and still today. There are a number of questions around this. There are also, it's claimed, 2 unmarked children's coffins found in or near to the tomb of King Edward IV inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor. This could also be the boys. There are too many questions that still exist around the disappearance of Edward V and Richard the Duke of York, and there is still much evidence being hunted for regarding what happened to them. But do you think their remains are inside of the urn within Westminster Abbey? One of the most notorious kings to reign over England was King Richard III. He's been portrayed throughout the centuries as a man who murdered his nephews so he could take the throne himself in a huge power grab during the Wars of the Roses. Richard's reign did not last long, as within 2 years of his crowning he would be lying dead on the battlefield, being slaughtered by the forces of his enemy, Henry Tudor. Richard's story has been one which has been muddled with legend. However, the true facts about his brutal death were uncovered when his remains were discovered under a car park in Leicester in 2013. But what is showed the world was that the last Plantagenet king of England died a horrifically barbaric death on the battlefield, and he suffered a number of earth-shattering wounds, particularly one which was fatal on the back of his skull. But what happened when the grave was opened and when the king's bones were discovered? Richard III was crowned king on the 6th of July 1483 inside of Westminster Abbey, and the Wars of the Roses had for decades gripped England. He was a king who had publicly denounced the princes in the Tower, his nephews, of whom one, King Edward V, was the rightful king of England. The 2 boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, were held inside the Tower of London, awaiting their coronation, when they disappeared. Many believed that Richard III, who seized the throne, was responsible for their murder and disappearance. However, Henry VII, or Henry Tudor as he was known, met Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August of 1485, and this would be considered the last, if not one of the final battles of the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War that had gripped the nation for decades, fought between the House of York and Lancaster. Richard had a much larger army, and facing him was Henry Tudor's forces, but also watching the proceedings was Lord Stanley, who led 6,000 men and mercenary soldiers who would later become the pivotal part of the battle. His support would change the tides of English history forever, and he would turn on his support for Richard III and support his stepson, Henry Tudor, and his forces waded in at the final part of the battle. It was claimed in the final minutes of the battle that Richard III fought in the thickest presses of his enemies, and that he in fact met a very brave demise in death. The king's men could smell victory, and they wanted to bring the battle to a close, and death with Henry Tudor himself. The king and a number of his men rode bravely towards Henry Tudor, who was being guarded by some bodyguards, and Richard, being a skilled military commander, smashed his way through the guards of Henry Tudor, and he personally killed the Tudor standard-bearer. He was fighting hand to hand, but at some point, whilst he was in boggy, marshy ground, Richard III was unhorsed and he came stuck. He had allegedly come within a sword's length of Henry Tudor, his enemy, but Richard found himself then overwhelmed by Lord Stanley's forces and soldiers. His horse had got stuck in the muddy terrain, and it was claimed that Richard was struggling in the mud and that the death blow was struck by a Welshman with a halberd whilst Richard's horse was stuck, and it was said that the blow was so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. It was alleged that specifically the man who killed Richard III was a Welshman called Rhys ap Thomas, who even shaved part of the king's skull when he struck him hard with his weapon. It was claimed that Richard fought very bravely, and it was also said that he fell in the field struck by many mortal wounds, and that they beat his head until his brains came out with blood, and they never left him until he was dead. Following this, the body of Richard III was stripped naked and was then paraded throughout the streets to Leicester, where it was placed on display for a number of days. For Henry VII, as he was now known, it was important for Richard's body to be seen, as the people of England needed to get the message about his death. But following the display of the dead king's remains, Richard's body was hastily buried inside the priory of the Great Friars inside of Leicester. In 1495, Henry VII commissioned an alabaster memorial to mark the site of Richard's burial, but the abbey was then demolished during the dissolution of the monasteries. There were many debates as to what happened to the remains of Richard III, including a very strong rumour, even told to me as a child, that his remains were thrown into the River Soar in Leicester. There were even plaques created around the city marking where it was believed his remains were thrown in the river off the bridges. However, this was not true. In 2013, one of the discoveries of the century was made, as the former site of the Grey Friars was located in the car park of a Leicester Council building, and then remarkably, a skeleton was found with battle wounds on it. Eventually, this skeleton was confirmed via DNA to have been that of King Richard III, over 500 years after his death. But the discovery of his body showed a barbaric and brutal death that the king suffered on the battlefield, and the true account of his death could be pieced together. Richard suffered 11 wounds on his skeleton, and 8 of these were to his skull. These had been sustained in the battle, and it alluded to the fact that the king lost his helmet during the last parts of the battle, and with this an attack was launched towards the king. There was more than one person using different weaponry that attacked Richard, and he also suffered a V-shaped cut along the bottom right part of his lower jaw, and his face was also cut by a knife or a dagger. Another cut on his lower jaw had also been made. But the body of Richard III was well protected, leading to the conclusion that he was wearing significant armour, which was effective, and he had little injury to his torso, meaning he was still wearing his armour when he was killed. There was another wound on the left above his ear and on top of his skull, but the wound that was fatal was brutal. 3 glancing blows caused by a sharp-bladed weapon, such as a sword, also caused further misery. but there was also a small piercing hole in the king's skull caused by a roundel dagger being driven into his skull, and this could have caused brain damage. The fatal wound was at the base of the skull, and this was a huge wound that showed a very powerful weapon, such as a bill or a halberd that struck Richard III at the side of his head and had smashed through the top of his vertebrae, shattering his neck. This had even sliced through his brain, and this would have been a wound that would have stopped anyone in their tracks, and he would never have recovered from this. It is likely that this could have killed Richard III instantly, and this is corroborated in the sources as being the wound inflicted by the Welshman with his halberd. Because of this allowed the historians to tell the story of the final moments of King Richard III's life over 500 years ago. Richard must have been in trouble following being unhorsed and stuck in the mud, and he then may have lost his helmet or have taken it off in an attempt to dive towards his enemy. He was thought left very vulnerable, and his enemies then jumped on him, and he was surrounded by the best armed medieval soldiers who were skilled with their weapons. His own men tried their best to fight for him and defend him, but Lord Stanley's forces waded in and overwhelmed Richard III and inflicted many different wounds upon him. But then the crushing blow from the halberd came, stopping the king there and then killing him and bringing the Plantagenet dynasty to an end. Following the end of the battle, the king's face was not heavily disfigured further, so that his body could be identified, and so the people in Leicester could see that their king was dead. Richard III was buried inside of a plain coffin, and over the centuries this had decayed, and the coffin was not found when Richard's body was, meaning that it had just left Richard's skeletal remains in the ground. But what the death of Richard III brought was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a ruling family who would for the next century change the face of England forever. We consider Henry VII's defeat of Richard III as something that stabilised England following the Wars of the Roses. However, his dynasty would bring the execution of queens, thousands of people across the land, and a huge amount of religious turmoil. One of the most influential and notorious royal families in history was the Tudors, and their kings and queens would change the face of England forever. Henry VIII was known for his brutality, and he would have 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. But Henry was never meant to have been king. It was his father, Henry VII, who founded the Tudor dynasty and ended the Wars of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York. But Henry VII reigned for a period of around 24 years, and he brought a lot of stability to the throne. But he died at the age of 52, leaving England in the hands of his son, Henry VIII, who would bring the nation under a significant number of changes himself. But did you know that Henry VII's burial vault was opened a number of times throughout the years? Henry VII became the King of England by the right of conquest, and he then married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions of the Wars of the Roses and to bring an end to decades of disputes over the rightful king. Some saw Henry as a usurper who had dethroned the rightful King Richard, but he faced a number of rebellions in the years after that came in the form of pretenders, with these claiming they were the princes in the Tower, or Edward V, the boy king who had disappeared from sight inside the Tower of London. He managed to put them down and would show a ruthless side, as he had some of his enemies executed. This showed that Henry VII was someone not to be crossed. Henry was not someone who knew how to run a nation, and he had a number of close advisors who helped him do this. He was more prudent than other monarchs, and he made the crown very rich, through raising taxes and increasing the ruthlessness in which these were collected. But some people were not happy to pay this. Henry VII was a man who was very shrewd, and throughout his reign one of the major boom industries was wool and cloth inside of England, and this was then traded around the world. He also increased his stranglehold over law and order, introducing justices of peace to make sure the nation's laws were being adhered to. Henry VII, despite having differing popularity, did manage to increase stability in the monarchy following the Civil War, but in 1502, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII's first son, Arthur, died. He was the heir to the throne and was very much the man expected to become the next Tudor king. He had died following his marriage to Catherine of Aragon inside of Ludlow Castle and passed away from the sweating sickness. This loss hurt the king greatly, and for a man who rarely showed any emotion in public, he was overwhelmed by grief. Henry VII would cry uncontrollably at court. However, further heartbreak came a year later as his wife, Elizabeth of York, died inside the Tower of London. She had just given birth, but days later both Elizabeth and the child died, and with this Henry VII was devastated and he shut himself away, and it was said he himself became very ill and almost died from this unknown illness. It was said the only woman who could bring him out of his upset was his mother, but following Elizabeth's death, he did consider remarrying. In February of 1508, it was noted that the king was suffering from gout, and it was also reported months later that he was in the last stages of consumption. Writers of the time noted how, in the final years of his life, that Henry VII had become sicker more often, and that things were getting more serious each time. It was also reported around this time that Henry VII was very ill and in extremis, and that he was very ill without hope of recovery. But the king managed to battle on as long as he could, and by the end of March 1509 he knew that death was on the horizon, and he drafted his last will and testament. The decline in the king's health was brought about by the fact he was grieving his wife and his son, and many of his close friends and loyal advisers also around this time became sick and ill. With this, Henry VII made sure there would be a seamless transition of power for his son Henry VIII to come onto the throne after his death. Accounts of the death of Henry VII mostly come from Bishop John Fisher. He stated that he said how 2 nights before the king's death he became so weak that he could not hear mass at the altar and had struggled for some time to eat and drink. However, he was keen to do his religious duty, and he summoned his confessor to his bedside to hear the sacrament. Mass at his bedside was heard. At Henry it was said to have been a very moving spectacle. It was said that those who witnessed Henry receiving the sacrament were moved with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that at some time they wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. On the day of his death he heard Mass again, and this time held the crucifix a number of times with great reverence, embracing it tenderly and kissing it. He was in a significant amount of pain and was suffering and scared, and he in his final moments appealed to Jesus to deliver his soul and to protect him. It was said he claimed, "O my blessed Jesus, O my Lord, deliver my soul from the misery of this world, deliver my soul from these deadly pains, deliver my could from this corruptible body." In his final moments, the king's son, Prince Henry, who was just 17 at the time, was summoned to his father's bedside for his final instructions, and the king said, "Fatherly and godly exhortations committed unto him the laborious governance of this realm of England." However, the original plan was for Henry VII to be buried inside of Windsor, and work had begun on rebuilding part of the chapel as a tomb house, but this was never finished. However, the Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey was being remodelled also, and this would become the resting place of Henry VII. His wife, Elizabeth of York, had been interred in a grave near the new Lady Chapel, but following Henry VII's death, the pair were then interred inside of a large burial vault in the heart of the chapel before the altar and opposite the tomb of Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. But Henry VII's tomb was actually placed in an eastern position in the chapel, presumably by Henry VIII, to then make way for his own burial. The tomb cost a huge sum of £1,500 and was made by Pietro Torrengiano of Florence. The monument has a black marble tomb chest and is ornamented with copper gilt, and also features the bronze effigies of the king and his queen. Henry VII and Elizabeth's coffins were buried here in a vault beneath the monument and tomb, and this vault is 2.7 metres long and 1.5 metres wide and high, and it is not the smallest. The lead coffins were covered with symbols such as Maltese crosses. However, the burial vault of Henry VII was broken into a number of times. The vault was opened first in 1603, and this was hugely significant as the body of Elizabeth I and her coffin was placed inside the same vault. Because of the size of the vault, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's coffin may have had to have been moved to the side. Elizabeth I's burial inside the same vault was significant as it was marking her as a very important Tudor monarch and one of the greatest, and it was an honour for her in death. However, she would not be laid to rest for long, as when James I came onto the throne, he ordered her to be buried in a vault with her half-sister, Mary I. Elizabeth I's coffin was removed and reburied elsewhere in Westminster Abbey, and then following the death of James I, his body was then interred inside of Henry VII's burial vault himself. It's almost as if James had Elizabeth I moved for himself. To incorporate James I's coffin, the outer wooden shells of Henry VII's coffin and Elizabeth of York's were removed to make room, and this left the first Tudor king and queen inside of their lead cases. But also at this point, the visceral urns of Henry and Elizabeth may have been moved elsewhere. These were the boxes and urns that held the hearts and internal organs of the king and queen after their death, and they were removed during the embalming process. But again, the vault of Henry VII would be opened one more time in 1869 by the curious Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley. He was looking for the coffin of James I, and of course he found this alongside Henry VII, and he commented on the lead shrouded body of Henry VII. He also sketched what he saw, and it was rather disturbing of an image, with the three shrouded bodies lying inside the vault eerily. Henry VII is remembered for being a steady king who brought stability following the Wars of the Roses. He was a man who would not spend too much during his reign, and he lived within his means, but taxed his population harshly at times, making the crown very rich. He would be buried inside the heart of his new mausoleum, the Lady Chapel, and he hoped that this would become a Tudor mausoleum for centuries to come. Within a century of his death, the Tudor period came to an end, and it would be the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who brought an end to the Tudor period.